The high, thin air of New Mexico territory tasted of dust and endings. For weeks, that taste had been Eleanor Bishop's constant companion, coating her tongue, settling in the folds of her traveling dress, and clouding the very color of the sky. It was the dust of a world she had only read about in pamphlets, a world of raw horizons and brutal sun that seemed determined to bake the memory of Boston right out of her bones. She stepped down from the wagon that had served as the final, bone-jarring leg of her journey, her legs unsteady, her spine a single, throbbing ache. The town of Redemption wasn't much of a town at all. It was a scar on the land, a handful of raw lumber buildings huddled together against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the desert. A man in a sweat-stained hat who had driven the wagon for the last 2 days grunted as he tossed her trunk into the dirt. "This is it, ma'am. Redemption." He did not offer to help her further. He did not even look at her. He just took his payment and turned the mules back the way they had come, leaving her alone in the middle of the main street, a solitary figure in dusty gray wool. Her groom, a Mr. Thomas Abernathy, was supposed to meet her. He had written letters filled with steady, if unimaginative, prose, describing his small but promising plot of land and his need for a wife to make it a home. He had sent a photograph of a man with a wide mustache and earnest eyes. He had seemed safe. He had seemed far away. That was all she had required. She waited. The sun beat down on her bonneted head. A dog with its ribs showing watched her from the shade of a water trough. Women, their faces weathered like old leather, peered at her from behind dusty curtains. Men, emerging from the swinging doors of the saloon, stopped to stare. Their eyes were not earnest. They were appraising, stripping her down to her desperation right there in the open street. A flush of shame, hot and familiar, crept up her neck. She drew her shoulders back, lifting her chin, a gesture of defiance she had perfected long ago. Finally, a man wearing a tarnished star on his vest ambled toward her. He was large, his belly straining the buttons of his shirt, and he moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. "You the mail-order bride for Tom Abernathy?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I am Miss Eleanor Bishop," she replied, her own voice sounding thin and foreign in the dry air. "Mr. Abernathy was to meet me." The sheriff chewed on something in his cheek, then spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her hem. "Well, you're late, Miss Bishop. About 3 nights too late." A cold knot formed in Eleanor's stomach. "I do not understand." "Not much to understand," the sheriff said, unimpressed. "Tom got into a disagreement over a hand of cards 3 nights back. The other fella had a faster draw." He paused, letting the words settle. "He's buried up on the hill." The town said some words. It was all proper. The world seemed to tilt, dead. The earnest eyes, the wide mustache, the small but promising plot of land, all gone, all just dust now, like everything else. The knot in her stomach tightened until she could hardly breathe. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a dead man. "I see," she whispered, though she saw nothing but the swirling dust motes in the harsh sunlight. "So that leaves you in a predicament," the sheriff continued, his eyes traveling over her in that same unnerving way as the other men. "You got return fare?" Eleanor's hand instinctively went to the small reticule tied at her wrist. There were a few dollars left, not nearly enough to get back to Boston. And even if it were, what was there to go back to? Nothing but another kind of cage. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. The sheriff nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "Well, then, seems to me you got 2 choices. You can get on the next wagon heading east and hope some charitable soul takes you the rest of the way." He let that hang in the air, the impossibility of it. "Or you can find another bed to keep you warm here in Redemption." His gaze was pointed, leaving no doubt as to his meaning. It was not a suggestion. It was a crude assessment of her value. Bile rose in her throat. This was what it came down to. This was the freedom she had sought. She was a piece of property without an owner, and the town was deciding her new price. A few men had drifted closer, drawn by the spectacle. They were grinning now, nudging each other. "I will not be," she started, her voice shaking with a rage that felt cold and sharp. "You won't be what?" one of the men called out, laughing. "Too good for us, Boston." Another man stepped forward. His breath soured with whiskey. He reached out a grimy hand as if to touch her arm. "Don't you worry, little lady. We'll take good care of you." Eleanor flinched back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was happening again. The feeling of being cornered, of being powerless while men with cold eyes decided her fate. The memory of a lavish parlor, of a heavy hand and a whispered threat, flashed through her mind, so vivid it stole her breath. Then a shadow fell over them. It was not a large shadow, but it was enough to make the men pause. A man had come up from the direction of the livery, moving with a silence that was startling in the noisy, dusty street. He was lean, dressed in worn denim and leather, his dark hair long enough to brush the collar of his shirt. His face was all sharp angles and sun-browned skin, but it was his eyes that held the attention. They were dark, quiet, and missed nothing. He did not look at the men who were harassing her. He looked only at her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. His voice was low and calm, with a rough edge to it, like stones rubbing together. The sheriff turned, annoyed at the interruption. "This is town business. Maddox, stay out of it." The man, Maddox, did not acknowledge the sheriff. His dark eyes remained on Eleanor, a question in them. He was not offering rescue, not in the way a knight in a storybook might. He was simply offering a pause, a moment for the ugliness to break. Eleanor found her voice. "These men were just leaving," she said, directing her words to Maddox, but her glare to the drunken man in front of her. The drunken man bristled. "Who says we were?" Maddox shifted his weight slightly. He did not raise his hands. He did not make a threat. He simply looked at the man, a long, steady look that seemed to measure and dismiss him all at once. For a moment, the air crackled with tension. Then, the man seemed to think better of it. He spat on the ground and shuffled back, muttering under his breath. The others followed, melting back toward the saloon. The sheriff shot Maddox a look of pure dislike. "You got a habit of sticking your nose where it ain't wanted." "Just passing through, Sheriff," Maddox said, his voice still quiet. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the livery stable without a backward glance. The interruption was over, but it had changed something. The men were gone, and the sheriff seemed to have lost his appetite for the game. He gave her one last, contemptuous look. "Figure it out, Miss Bishop. The town ain't a charity." He turned and walked back to his office, leaving her standing alone with her trunk in the middle of the street. The dust settled. The silence returned, heavier than before. Eleanor stood frozen, her pride a fragile shield against the terror that was beginning to set in. She had no money, no home, and no one. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. Soon it would be dark. She did not know how long she stood there before he reappeared. Colt Maddox emerged from the livery, leading a horse. He stopped a few feet away from her, his expression unreadable. "You have a place to stay?" he asked, his voice low. She did not want to admit her desperation to this stranger, to anyone, but the truth was a hard, undeniable thing. "No." He nodded, as if he already knew. He looked off toward the low hills beyond the town, then back at her. "I work a ranch, Henderson's place. It's a few miles north of here. There's an empty bunk in the old bunkhouse. It's not much, but it's a roof." She stared at him, suspicion and fear warring with the cold, practical reality of her situation. A man she did not know was offering her shelter. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. Find another bed. Was this any different? As if reading her thoughts, he added, Mr. Henderson runs a clean outfit. His wife, Clara, there are rules. You'd keep to yourself. Help with chores if you want to earn your keep. That's all. Why? She asked, the word coming out sharper than she intended. Why would you offer? He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond that unnerving calm. It was not pity. It was something closer to recognition. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go, he said simply. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. He bent down, lifted her heavy trunk with an ease that surprised her, and slung it over the back of his horse. Well, he asked, looking at her. Coming? She had no other choice. With a deep breath that filled her lungs with more of that endless dust, she nodded. The Henderson Ranch was a world away from the grasping desperation of redemption. It was a place of work, of routine, of a silence that was not empty but filled with the sounds of life, the lowing of cattle, the nicker of horses, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil. Eleanor was given the old bunkhouse, a small, one-room cabin set apart from the main house and the men's quarters. It was sparse, with a narrow cot, a small stove, and a single window that looked out onto the horse corral. But it was clean, and it had a door with a lock, for the first time in weeks. Eleanor felt she could breathe. The rules were simple, laid out by Colt on that first ride out. She was not to go to the men's bunkhouse. She was to take her meals alone. After the Hendersons and the ranch hands had eaten, she was to make herself useful. But stay out of the way. He spoke with a bluntness that left no room for misunderstanding. It was a business arrangement, a temporary port in a storm, nothing more. Slowly, painfully, Eleanor began to learn. Clara Henderson, a stern woman with tired eyes, showed her how to cook with cornmeal and lard, how to pluck a chicken, how to coax eggs from the hens in the henhouse. Her soft Boston hands, accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, became chapped, calloused, and burned. She learned to mend harnesses and wash clothes in a tub of harsh lye soap until her knuckles were raw. She learned the language of survival, a vocabulary of hard work and aching muscles. And she watched Colt Maddox. He was a man of few words and even fewer wasted movements. Most days he was in the round pen, working with the wild mustangs that were brought down from the hills. He never seemed to fight the horses. He moved with them, a slow, patient dance of advance and retreat, his voice a low, constant murmur. He would stand in the swirling dust for hours, his focus absolute, until the wildness in the animal's eye gave way to a grudging trust. He was calm, he was silent, and in his presence, the horses, and Eleanor herself, felt a strange sense of peace. She saw the way the other ranch hands treated him. They worked with him, but there was a distance. They called him Maddox, never Colt. They spoke to him when necessary, but never in the easy, joking way they spoke to each other. She noticed the slight curl of the sheriff's lip whenever he rode out to the ranch. She saw how Clara Henderson's face tightened when Colt entered the main house for his pay. He was an outsider, just like her, but in a way she did not yet understand. Her own past was a constant, unwelcome guest. Some nights, she would wake up from a dream of a Boston drawing room, the air thick with perfume and unspoken cruelty. She would see James Rathburn's face, handsome and perfect to the world, but twisted into a mask of cold fury when they were alone. She remembered the weight of his hand, the hiss of his voice in her ear as he told her how ungrateful she was, how he was only teaching her to be a proper wife. She remembered the dismissive look in her own father's eyes when she had tried to show him the bruises, the way he had said, "James is a man of standing. Eleanor, do not be hysterical." She had fled not just an engagement, but a world that refused to see, a world that had left her utterly alone with her terror. Here, at least, the dangers were in the open. A rattlesnake warned you before it struck. One evening, after the chores were done, She saw a flicker of light from a small campfire near the edge of the property, far from the main house. She walked toward it, her footsteps soft in the dirt. It was Colt, sitting on a log, staring into the flames. He had a bottle of whiskey beside him, but he was not drinking. He was just watching the fire, his face a mask of stone. She almost turned back, feeling like an intruder on some private grief, but something made her stay. She sat down on the other end of the log, leaving a respectable distance between them. For a long time, they said nothing. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely call of a coyote in the distance. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of the things that weighed them down. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "My mother is buried not far from here." She did not know what to say. "I am sorry," she murmured. He shook his head, a small, bitter movement. She was Apache. She gathered herbs and roots in the hills, knew more about healing than any doctor in the territory. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. A few years back, some settlers' children got sick. They decided it was her doing, said she put a curse on them. He fell silent again, and Eleanor held her breath, knowing there was more. "A group of them rode out to our cabin," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They dragged her out. My father tried to stop them. He was a white man, a trapper, but he loved her. It made no difference." He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing something far away, something terrible. "They killed her right there, said they were cleansing the land of her devilry." A cold horror washed over Eleanor. "Afterward," Colt went on, his voice a dead monotone, "they took my father to town. The sheriff held a trial. Took about an hour. They hung him the same day for defending his wife. Called it interfering with justice." He finally looked up from the fire, his dark eyes meeting hers. In their depths, she saw a pain so profound it had burned away everything but a cold, hard resolve. He was a man made of scars, just as she was. His were from the cruelty of this new land. Hers were from the polished cruelty of the old one. But they were scars all the same. In that moment, she understood the distance the others kept from him. It was not just because he was half Apache. It was because he carried a story they did not want to hear, a truth about themselves they could not face. They sat in silence for another hour. The unspoken understanding, a tangible thing between them. Their shared silence had become a bond, a language all its own. A week later, the storm came. It rolled in from the west, a bruised, purple wall of cloud that swallowed the sun and plunged the afternoon into a premature twilight. The wind rose to a howl, whipping dust and debris into the air. Eleanor had been in the barn, mending a saddle blanket, when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that turned the dusty ranch yard into a sea of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud it shook the very timbers of the barn. She was trapped. She stood in the wide doorway, watching the lightning split the sky, when Colt appeared, leading a skittish young colt into the shelter. He was soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt clinging to the lean muscles of his back and chest. He worked to calm the horse, his voice the same low murmur he used in the round pen. He finished settling the animal in a stall and turned to her. "Looks like you're stuck here for a while," he said, his voice raised slightly over the roar of the storm. Water dripped from his hair and ran in rivulets down his face. She just nodded, hugging her arms to her chest, suddenly cold. The barn was vast and filled with shadows, the air thick with the smell of rain, wet hay, and horses. Another crack of lightning lit the space, and in that stark, blue-white flash, their eyes met. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks suddenly vanished. They were just two people, a man and a woman, alone in the heart of a storm. He took a step toward her. "Away from the horses," She did not move back. The rain hammered on the roof, a relentless, deafening drumbeat. He stopped in front of her. So close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the tension in his jaw, the dark conflict in his eyes. This was dangerous. This was a line they were not supposed to cross. But the storm, the confinement, the unspoken things that had passed between them by the fire, it was all a kind of pressure, building and building until it had to break. He raised a hand, as if to touch her face, then let it drop. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips was both strange and intimate. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and angry, a collision of loneliness and frustration. His lips were hard, demanding, and his hand came up to grip her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and dust and all the words they had never said. For a stunned second, she was rigid with shock. Then, something inside her, something she had kept locked away for years, broke free. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to clutch at his wet shirt, her own desperation matching his. It was a raw, aching acknowledgement of the pain they both carried, a brief, violent rebellion against a world that had tried to break them. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. He pulled back, his breathing ragged. They stared at each other, shaken, the sound of the rain filling the sudden, charged silence between them. His eyes were dark, filled with a regret so sharp it was like a physical blow. Eleanor's heart was pounding. Her lips burned. She was terrified, not of him, but of what she had just felt, what she had just allowed. The old instinct, the instinct to hide, to deny, to survive, took over. She looked away, toward the gray sheet of rain. Her voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Don't tell anyone." He did not answer. He just stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from his hair onto the dusty floorboards. Then he turned and walked back to the stalls, leaving her alone in the doorway, trembling, as they pretended it had never happened at all. The silence that followed the kiss in the barn was louder than the storm had ever been. In the days that followed, Eleanor and Colt moved around each other like two planets in a careful, unwilling orbit, close enough to feel the pull but never touching. He was up before dawn and gone, returning after she had finished her supper and retreated to the solitude of her bunkhouse. They avoided each other's eyes. If their paths crossed in the ranch yard, they would offer a clipped nod, the air between them thick with the memory of rain and desperation. They pretended it did not happen, but the pretense was a thin, brittle thing. It lived in every stolen glance, in the careful distance they kept, in the way the name Eleanor was never spoken by him again. But a secret between two people is one thing. The hungry imagination of a small, bored town is another. Redemption did not need facts. It only needed a story. And the story of the quiet, proud woman from Boston living out at the Henderson Ranch was a good one. It began with whispers among the women over their washing, morphed into knowing smirks from the men at the saloon, and finally hardened into a solid, ugly certainty. A woman alone, living near a bunkhouse full of men. There could only be one reason. The change was palpable. When Eleanor rode into town for supplies, conversations would stop. Women would pull their children closer, their faces pinched with disapproval. Men would watch her with a new, bolder insolence in their eyes, their leers now laced with a crude familiarity, as if she were public property. She was no longer just the unfortunate mail-order bride. She was the fallen woman, the ranch hand's convenience. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. She, who had guarded her solitude so fiercely, who had barely spoken to any man but Colt, was being condemned for sins she had never even contemplated. The final blow came not from the town, but from within the fragile sanctuary of the ranch itself. Clara Henderson found her by the chicken coop one afternoon, her face set in grim lines. "Eleanor," she began, her voice devoid of its usual tired warmth. "There is talk." Eleanor's hands stilled in the basket of eggs she was gathering. She did not need to ask what kind of talk. She could see it in the woman's hard, unforgiving eyes. "It is not true," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "Truth does not matter in a place like this," Clara replied, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor's worn dress, her chapped hands. "What matters is a woman's reputation. It is all she has. My husband, he runs a decent place. He cannot have this kind of shadow falling on it. The other ranchers, their wives, they are talking. They say we are harboring a loose woman." The words were like stones, hard and bruising. "I have done nothing," Eleanor whispered, the protest sounding weak even to her own ears. "You have stayed," Clara said, "and that, it seemed, was the crime. You are a single woman, alone. It is not a sustainable situation. It invites trouble." She took a deep breath. "I am sorry. You have been a hard worker, but you will have to be gone by the end of the week." The world, which had seemed to be slowly, cautiously righting itself, capsized once more, to be cast out again, with even less than she had arrived with, was a terrifying prospect. The dust of redemption, the leering men, the sheriff's crude proposition, it was all waiting for her. She stood there, the basket of eggs suddenly heavy in her hands, her carefully constructed composure crumbling into dust. She managed a single, stiff nod, unable to speak past the lump of despair in her throat. Later that evening, Colt found her in her bunkhouse. She was packing her few belongings into her trunk, her movements stiff and mechanical. He stood in the doorway, a tall silhouette against the fading light, his face unreadable. He had heard, of course he had heard, news, good or bad, traveled fast on a ranch. "It is true, then," he said. It was not a question. She did not look at him. "Mrs. Henderson was kind to let me stay as long as I have." Her voice was brittle. He was silent for a long moment, watching her fold her one good dress. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I do not know," she admitted, her voice cracking on the last word. She stopped packing and sank onto the edge of the cot, her face in her hands. The fight had gone out of her. He stepped into the small room. It was the first time he had ever been inside her bunkhouse. He seemed too large for the space, his presence filling it completely. He did not touch her. He just stood there, a few feet away, his quiet gaze on her bent head. "Marry me," he said. Her head snapped up. She stared at him. Sure, she had misheard. His expression was utterly serious. There was no softness in it, no hint of affection. It was the face of a man making a grim calculation. "What?" she breathed. "Marry me," he repeated, his voice low and even. The law protects a married woman, gives her a name, a place. They cannot just throw you out. The sheriff cannot touch you. No one can. She was speechless, her mind reeling. Marriage. To him. The man she had kissed in a moment of storm-tossed madness. The man she had barely spoken to since... It was absurd. It was insane. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. "Why would you do that?" He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the single dusty window. "I put you in this position," he said, his voice tight. "When I stopped those men in town, when I brought you here, I made you my business. I will see it through." It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of responsibility, as stark and unadorned as the landscape outside. He was offering her a shield, a name, a legal fiction to stand between her and the world's cruelty. He was offering it not out of passion, but out of a sense of duty she could not begin to comprehend. She thought of Boston, of a marriage that was meant to be a prison, built on her father's business dealings and James Rathburn's cold ambition. She had fled that. Now she was being offered another kind of prison, perhaps a marriage of convenience to a silent, haunted man she did not know. But it was also a lifeline, the only one she had. "You do not know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he said, his eyes meeting hers again, and in them, she saw the same thing she had seen by the fire, the quiet recognition of a fellow survivor. She took a shaky breath. "All right," she said. The wedding took place 2 days later. At dawn, there was a traveling preacher, a man named Reverend Gideon, who happened to be passing through the territory. Colt had sought him out, paid him a few dollars to perform the ceremony in the hills, far from the prying eyes of redemption. Eleanor did not have a wedding dress. She wore her gray wool traveling suit, the one she had arrived in. She had brushed it clean, but it was still a somber garment for a bride. There were no flowers, only the pale sagebrush that dotted the landscape, its leaves silvery in the first light of day. The air was cold, and a thin mist clung to the hollows of the hills. Reverend Gideon was a thin, weary man whose words seemed to get lost in the vast emptiness of the morning. He read from a small, battered Bible, his voice a low drone against the silence. Eleanor stood beside Colt, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play about two other people. Colt was a statue beside her, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not look at her once. When it came time for the vows, her voice was a near whisper. His was a low, steady rumble. They exchanged no rings. When the preacher finally said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," there was an awkward, heavy silence. No one kissed her hand. Colt did not lean in to kiss her. The moment simply passed, unmarked. They were married. It was done, a legal fact, signed on a piece of paper that the preacher folded and tucked into his pocket. The ride back to the ranch was as silent as the ceremony. Nothing felt different, yet everything had changed. When they arrived, the ranch was just beginning to stir. Colt dismounted and helped her down, his hands impersonal on her waist. He gestured toward the main ranch house. "There is a small room off the back. It was for storage. I cleaned it out. You can stay there now." And that was it. She was no longer relegated to the bunkhouse on the edge of the property. She had been moved closer to the center, into the main house itself, but the distance between them felt vaster than ever. They went back to their lives, husband and wife in name only, two strangers sharing a roof and a secret. They ate their meals at the same table as the Hendersons, the silence between them a testament to their strange arrangement. Clara Henderson's face was a mask of confusion and disapproval, but she could say nothing. Eleanor was Mrs. Maddox now. She had a place, but the tension that had existed before the wedding now coiled between them, tighter and more dangerous. It was in the way his eyes would follow her as she moved around the kitchen, a flicker of something dark and unreadable in their depths. It was in the way her breath would catch when he entered a room, his presence an immediate, physical thing. It was in the accidental brush of his hand against hers as she passed him a plate, a spark of heat that left them both pulling back as if burned. They argued over nothing, the way she stacked the firewood, the amount of salt she put in the stew, the mending of a tear in his shirt. The anger was a release, a way to speak to each other without saying any of the things that truly mattered. It was safer to fight about a misplaced hammer than to talk about the cold, empty bed in her room, or the lonely weight of the new name she carried. The town of Redemption, thwarted in its attempt to cast her out, found a new target for its venom. The whispers about Eleanor, the loose woman, slowly died down, replaced by a new, more vicious strain of gossip. Now, the talk was about Colt, the half-blood, the quiet, dangerous man who had somehow managed to trick a white woman from the East into marrying him. Neighbors who had once been civil to Mr. Henderson now rode past the ranch without a wave. At the feed store, the owner would serve Colt last, with a sneer. The word breed was muttered just loud enough for him to hear. The prejudice that had always simmered just beneath the surface now boiled over. And Eleanor, by marrying him, had thrown herself into the pot with him. She had not realized that in accepting his protection, she would be exposing him to a greater danger. The breaking point came on a Saturday, when they rode into town for supplies. The general store was crowded. As Eleanor stood at the counter, waiting for the proprietor to weigh out a bag of flour, she heard two women talking behind her. "It is a shame, is what it is," one of them said, her voice sharp. "A decent woman, even if she is from back east, tying herself to his kind, marrying into that blood." "You have to wonder what he did to her," the other replied, her voice dripping with insinuation. "A man like that, they say the Apache in him makes him animal." Something cold and furious ignited in Eleanor's chest. It was the same fury she had felt when James Rathburn had called her hysterical, the same helpless rage at a world that judged and condemned without knowledge or compassion. But this time, it was not for herself. It was for the man who stood silently by the door, the man who had offered her his name when she had nothing. She turned around, her eyes blazing. "You will be silent," she said, her voice low and trembling, but carrying through the suddenly quiet store. "You know nothing of my husband. He is a better man than any you will find gossiping in this town." The women stared at her, their mouths agape. Before anyone else could react, a man stepped forward. It was the sheriff's deputy, a young, arrogant man named Miller with a cruel twist to his mouth. "That is enough out of you," he said, grabbing her arm. "You will show respect." "I will not," Eleanor shot back, trying to pull her arm free. "Not to those who speak such poison." The deputy's face darkened. He shoved her, hard. She stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard. As she fell, his hand lashed out, and the crack of his palm against her cheek echoed in the stunned silence. She hit the floor, her head striking the leg of a barrel. A sharp, metallic taste filled her mouth. In an instant, Colt was there. He did not make a sound, but the change in him was terrifying. The quiet, watchful calm was gone, replaced by a stillness that was lethal. His eyes were black ice, and his hands were curled into fists at his sides. For a heartbeat, Eleanor was certain he was going to kill the deputy right there in the middle of the store. The air crackled, thick with the promise of violence. But he did not move. He stood over her, his body a rigid line of suppressed fury, his gaze locked on the deputy. He was holding himself back by a thread, and everyone in that room knew it. The deputy, for all his arrogance, seemed to shrink back, his hand hovering near the gun on his hip. Slowly, deliberately, Colt bent down. He helped Eleanor to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked at the blood trickling from the corner of her mouth, and a muscle in his jaw clenched so hard it was a wonder it did not break. Without another word, he led her out of the store, leaving their supplies behind on the counter. The ride back to the ranch was a long, terrible silence. When they reached the cabin, she slid from her horse and went inside, her body shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, aching hurt, both physical and emotional. She sat at the small wooden table, touching her fingers to her split lip, wincing at the sting. He came in a few moments later, carrying a small basin of water and a clean cloth. He set them on the table in front of her. He did not speak. He knelt on the floor beside her chair, the movement so unexpected it startled her. He dipped the cloth in the water, wrung it out, and gently, so gently, began to clean the blood from her face. His hands, which were so strong and calloused from breaking horses and mending fences, were now impossibly tender. She looked down at his dark head, at the concentration in his face as he tended to her injury. He was kneeling at her feet, this silent, proud, dangerous man. "I am not scared of you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He paused, the cloth held still against her lip. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a storm of emotions she could not name. "You should be," he whispered back, his voice rough. But his actions betrayed his words. He was not a monster. He was a man holding back a lifetime of rage. A man who had just shown more restraint in the face of a public humiliation than any man she had ever known. And he had done it for her. The space between them, once filled with silence and anger, was now filled with something else entirely. Something fragile and powerful and terrifying. He finished cleaning the cut and remained kneeling before her, his hand still resting on the table near hers. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers, asking a question for which there were no words. This time, it was not a desperate, angry collision in a storm. It was a slow, aching inevitability. He kissed her, his lips gentle at first, then harder, deeper, as if he were trying to taste the very soul of her. And she let him. She wanted him too. She met his kiss with a hunger that matched his own, a raw need to be seen, to be held, to find a moment of peace in the midst of the war that was their life. Later, they lay in the darkness of her small room, the silence a soft blanket around them. The anger was gone. The tension eased into a quiet, exhausted intimacy. She was curled against his side, his arm a solid, warm weight across her body. It was the first time she had felt truly safe since leaving Boston. She turned her head, her lips brushing against his chest. "Don't tell anyone," she whispered into the darkness. The old refrain, the prayer of a woman who had lived her life in fear of exposure. "This time," he answered. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room, a solemn vow. "I promise." The fragile peace they had found in each other's arms was as fleeting as a desert mirage. It was a warmth that could not hold against the cold reality that was about to ride into town. The new reality arrived not in a dusty wagon, but in a polished black carriage drawn by two perfectly matched bays. A stark and gleaming intrusion from another world. It rolled down the main street of redemption like a vessel from a foreign shore, kicking up the common dust with an air of profound indifference. Eleanor was in the general store, a list of necessities in her hand, when she saw it through the window. A cold dread, sharp and sickeningly familiar, seized her. She knew that carriage. She knew the crest on its door. Her breath caught in her throat, a small, strangled sound. The world seemed to shrink to the size of that window, to the man who was now stepping out onto the street. It was James Rathburn. He looked exactly as he had in Boston, impossibly clean in this filthy town. His suit was perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror's shine, his blonde hair untouched by the wind and dust. He moved with an unshakable confidence, the assurance of a man who believed the world was his to command. As he looked around, his lip curled in a faint, dismissive sneer. This was the man she had fled. This was the architect of her nightmares. Their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, his expression was one of mild annoyance, as if spotting a misplaced piece of furniture. Then, it hardened into a look of cold possession. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, a smile that had never once reached his eyes. He started toward the store. Eleanor was frozen, her blood turning to ice. The sounds of the store faded away. All she could hear was the echo of his voice in a darkened parlor, hissing threats that no one else ever heard. All she could feel was the memory of his grip on her arm, a grip that left bruises in the shape of his fingers. He entered the store, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and the cold, oppressive air of the world she had run from. The proprietor, who had been grumbling about the price of beans, fell silent, his eyes wide at the sight of such an obvious gentleman. "Eleanor," James said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was utterly alien here. "What a chase you have led me on. I must confess, I was beginning to worry." He made it sound like a game, a playful dalliance. but his eyes were like chips of blue ice, and they held no playfulness at all. They held the promise of retribution. "James," she managed to whisper, her voice a reedy thing. "What are you doing here?" "Why, I have come to collect what is mine, of course," he said, his smile widening. He took a step closer. "My fiancée, who, it seems, was abducted from her journey by some local savage and has been held here against her will." His words were for the room, for the proprietor and the handful of other customers who were now staring, enthralled by the drama. He was painting a picture, creating a narrative in which he was the hero, the rescuer, before Eleanor could deny it, to scream that she had fled, that he was the monster. Colt's voice cut through the air from the doorway. He had been waiting outside with the horses. "She is not your fiancée," Colt said, his voice low and steady. He stepped inside, and the contrast between the two men was absolute. Colt was the land itself, all worn leather and dust and quiet strength. James was the railroad, all polished steel and relentless force, come to conquer it. "She is my wife." James's gaze slid over to Colt, taking in his worn clothes, his dark hair, the unmistakable cast of his features. A look of utter contempt filled his face. "Your wife?" he laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This half-breed?" He turned back to the room. "You see, the poor woman is clearly terrified. She will say anything this animal tells her to. She needs to be protected." He reached for Eleanor's arm. Instinct, born of long and painful experience, took over. She flinched back, stumbling away from his touch, her body reacting before her mind could. She bumped into Colt, who put a steadying hand on her back. The warmth of his touch through her dress was a small, solid anchor in a sea of terror. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. James Rathburn, the railroad tycoon whose tracks were even now inching their way across the territory, a man who brought money and power wherever he went, versus Colt Maddox, the quiet, half-Apache ranch hand that most of the town already despised. It was no contest. The sheriff arrived, drawn by the commotion. He took one look at James's expensive suit, listened to 5 minutes of his smooth, commanding story, and his loyalties were decided. James spoke of laws, of contracts, of a marriage agreement signed by Eleanor's father. He spoke of his concern for her welfare, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He produced a wallet thick with bills, and in a quiet conversation in the corner of the store, a business transaction was completed. The law, such as it was in redemption, was bought and paid for. The town, which had needed little reason to hate Colt, now had a cause. They had a wealthy, powerful white man telling them what they already believed, that Colt was a savage, a danger, a contamination. James Rathburn became a fixture in the saloon, buying rounds of drinks, telling stories of Eleanor's delicate nature, her vulnerability. He spun a tale of a heroic rescue, casting himself as the grieving fiancé, and the townspeople, eager for a villain, drank it all in. For Eleanor, the ranch became a prison of a different kind. The fragile intimacy she and Colt had begun to build was shattered by the looming shadow of James. Her old fears returned, potent and overwhelming. She would wake in the night, gasping for breath, the scent of James's cologne in her nostrils, the feel of his cold hand on her skin. She was torn between the familiar terror of her past and the uncertain, terrifying reality of her present. She saw the way Colt watched James's carriage from the hills, his face a mask of cold fury. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand would often rest near the Colt peacemaker that hung on his hip. She knew that a confrontation was inevitable, and she knew how it would end. James had the law, the money, and the town on his side. Colt had only his gun and a rage that, once unleashed, she feared would consume him. One night, while he was out checking on a sick foal, she crept into his room. His gun belt was hanging on a peg by the door. With trembling hands, She took the heavy pistol from its holster. It felt cold and deadly in her hands. She wrapped it in an old piece of burlap and hid it at the bottom of her trunk, beneath her winter clothes. She did not know if she was protecting him from James, or protecting James from him. She only knew that she could not bear to witness the violence that was coming. She was trying to stop the storm, armed with nothing but her own fear. The poison James had been pouring into the town's ear finally bore fruit. At a hastily called town council meeting, a new ordinance was proposed, citing concerns about safety and proper land distribution. It declared that no one of mixed blood could own or lay claim to land within the township's boundaries. It was a law written for one man. It passed with a unanimous vote. The next day, Mr. Henderson rode out to the corral where Colt was working. He was a decent man, but he was also a man who had to live in the world as it was. His face was etched with shame. "Colt," he said, his voice low, "I cannot keep you on. Rathburn, he has made it clear. Anyone who employs you will find their contracts with the railroad terminated." He could not meet Colt's eyes. "And with this new law, I'm sorry. You and your wife will have to be off the property by morning." It was the end. They were exiles. They packed their few belongings in silence. Eleanor retrieved the gun from her trunk and, without a word, handed it back to Colt. He took it, his eyes questioning, but he said nothing. He slid it back into its holster, the weight of it seeming to settle on him, a burden he was fated to carry. They left the Henderson ranch, the only home she had known in this harsh land, and rode out into the desert, with no destination and no plan. They found shelter in an abandoned line shack, a relic from an old telegraph line that had long since been rerouted. It was nestled deep in a series of dry, dusty canyons, a place the rest of the world had forgotten. The shack was little more than a single room with a dirt floor, a crumbling fireplace, and a roof that leaked dust with every gust of wind. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rat droppings. Scorpions skittered in the dark corners, their bodies pale and ghostly in the moonlight. It was a place of profound loneliness, a final, desperate retreat. In the suffocating confines of the shack, with the vast, indifferent desert pressing in on all sides, Eleanor began to unravel. The days were a blur of heat and silence. The nights were filled with the chittering of unseen creatures and the heavy weight of their shared despair. She looked at Colt, at his grim, set face, at the way he stood guard at the door for hours, and a wave of guilt so powerful it was nauseating washed over her. "This is my fault," she whispered one evening, her voice raw. They were sitting by a small, smoky fire he had built in the hearth. "All of it. If I had never come here, if you had never helped me, you would still have your job. You would still have a home." He did not look at her. He stared into the flames, his profile carved from stone. "No," he said, his voice flat. "This was always coming. Rathburn just gave them a name for it." "I have ruined your life," she sobbed, the words torn from her. "I bring this poison with me wherever I go." He was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "You did not ruin my life. It was ruined a long time ago." He picked up a piece of broken mirror that lay near the hearth, a shard left by some previous, long-gone occupant. He stared at his own reflection in the jagged piece of glass. "I have killed men before," he said, the confession dropping into the silence between them like a stone. "Not just outlaws. I killed 2 men in a town up north. They cornered me in an alley. They had been drinking. They called me an animal, a red-skinned devil." He paused, his knuckles white as he gripped the piece of mirror. "They said I was not fit to walk the same street as them. They pulled their knives. I was faster with my gun." He looked up from the mirror, his eyes black holes of pain. "But they were right. There is an animal in me. Eleanor. Something that wants to tear and break and destroy. I keep it on a chain, but it is always there. And when men like Rathburn, men like that deputy, when they look at me, that is all they see. And the animal. it hears them. With a sudden violent roar of pure, undiluted rage, he hurled the piece of mirror against the stone fireplace. It shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments. He slammed his fist into the rough wooden mantelpiece again and again, the sound a sickening thud of bone against wood. "Colt!" Eleanor screamed, scrambling to his side. He finally stopped, his shoulders heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned his forehead against the mantel, his body trembling with the force of his own fury. Blood dripped from his knuckles onto the dirt floor. She did not hesitate. She took his bloodied hand in hers, gently prying his fingers open. The skin was split and raw. Without thinking, she lifted his hand to her lips and kissed the scars, the old ones and the new, tasting the salt of his blood and his pain. She held his hand to her cheek, her own tears now falling freely. He turned slowly, his wildness receding, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability she had never seen before. He looked at her tears, at the way she clung to his broken hand. And something in his own eyes broke. He reached out with his other hand and gently brushed the tears from her cheek, his touch as light as a whisper. In the dark, scorpion-infested shack, surrounded by the ruins of their lives, they found each other. He drew her into his arms, and she went willingly, burying her face in his chest. They held each other for a long time, two broken people finding solace in the simple, solid presence of the other. Later, in the dead of night, they made love. It was not the desperate, angry kiss of the storm, nor the tentative, aching exploration of the night he had tended her split lip. This was something else. It was the full, unvarnished truth of who they were. It was not perfect. It was clumsy and raw, rooted in pain and tenderness and a desperate, primal hunger to feel alive, to feel human, in a world that had tried to strip all humanity from them. It was a claiming, a silent vow made not before a preacher, but before the vast, starry emptiness of the desert night. In the ruins, they were building something new. In the pale, gray light of dawn, she lay curled beside him, her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by something else now, something warm and fragile and fiercely alive. She thought of James, of the town, of the danger that waited for them just beyond the canyon walls. She lifted her head, her voice a near inaudible whisper in the morning quiet. "Don't tell anyone." But this time, as she said the words, a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Colt looked at her, his dark eyes soft in the morning light. He gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "Maybe," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe it is time we did." James Rathburn did not operate with the crude, immediate violence of a saloon brawler. His weapon was money, and he wielded it with a surgical precision. In the dusty confines of the sheriff's office, he laid out his strategy, not as a suggestion, but as a series of commands. Bills were laid upon the desk, a silent, compelling argument that Sheriff Miller found impossible to refute. The story was simple, elegant, and perfectly tailored to the prejudices of the town. A vulnerable young woman of good breeding, abducted and coerced into a sham marriage by a dangerous half-breed. It was not a matter of law, James explained, but of rescue, a moral imperative. "She is my property by contract, Sheriff," James said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Her father and I had an arrangement. What I need is a posse, not to harm her, of course, simply to retrieve her, by force or by charm, whichever proves necessary." The sheriff, his pockets now considerably heavier, was eager to oblige. He deputized 5 men, a motley collection of drifters and malcontents who were loyal to anyone with a full bottle or a silver dollar. They were not lawmen. They were hired thugs given the flimsy cover of a tarnished star. Their task was to bring Eleanor back, and to deal with the man she was with as they saw fit. The word abductor was used often, a convenient label that stripped Colt of his rights and painted a target on his back. Deep in the canyons, the world had shrunk to the size of survival. The love they had found was a fragile seedling in a vast, arid wilderness, and their days were consumed by the simple, brutal necessities of staying alive. Water, their most precious commodity, was running low. The small spring they had been using had slowed to a muddy trickle, forcing them to venture further, to a deeper, more reliable pool of water nestled at the base of a rock formation a mile from the shack. It was a place of quiet beauty. Cottonwood trees clung to the edges of the pool, their leaves a splash of impossible green against the red rock. The air was cool and still. As Colt filled their canteens, Eleanor knelt at the water's edge, splashing the cool liquid on her dusty face. For a moment, a brief, deceptive moment, there was peace. They were just a man and a woman, alone in a hidden paradise. The first rifle shot shattered the stillness. The sound cracked against the canyon walls, sharp and final. Eleanor saw not a puff of smoke, but the result, Colt jerking backward as if struck by an invisible fist. A dark, wet stain blossomed on his side, spreading with shocking speed across the worn fabric of his shirt. He staggered, his hand going to the wound, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. For a heartbeat, Eleanor's world went silent and white. The old, familiar paralysis, the freezing terror of a cornered animal, threatened to consume her. Then she saw the men, 5 of them, emerging from the rocks above, rifles in hand, their faces grim with purpose. And in that instant, something inside her broke. It was not her spirit. It was her fear. It shattered, and in its place rose a white-hot, protective fury so intense it burned away everything else. "Well, now, look what we have here," one of the men said, sauntering down toward them. It was the deputy, Miller, a smug grin on his face. "Looks like the little lady's protector has had an accident." Another man, reeking of whiskey, reached for her. "Come on, sweetheart. Mister, Rathburn is waiting for you." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. It was the same touch, the same assumption of ownership she had felt from James, and she reacted not like Eleanor Bishop of Boston, but like a creature of the canyon, all instinct and survival. She twisted, her free hand grabbing a half-empty whiskey bottle one of the men had dropped. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she smashed it against a rock. The glass shattered, leaving her holding the jagged neck. The man holding her laughed. "What are you going to do with that, little girl?" She did not answer with words. She lunged, driving the broken glass into the fleshy part of his forearm. He screamed, a high, surprised sound, and let her go, stumbling back, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The deputy raised his rifle. "Crazy woman!" Eleanor did not wait. She scrambled to where Colt lay, his breathing shallow, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. He was losing blood. Too much, too fast. She had to move him. Now. She hooked her arms under his, trying to drag him. He was a dead weight, impossibly heavy. The men were regrouping, their surprise turning to anger. "Just grab her," Miller yelled. Adrenaline surged through her. She heaved, her muscles screaming in protest, and managed to drag Colt behind a large boulder, out of their immediate line of sight. They needed cover. They needed to get away. She could hear the men cursing and arguing. They had not expected a fight. They had expected a frightened woman and a dead man. She had given them neither. She half-dragged, half-carried Colt, her body fueled by a desperate, frantic energy. She moved from rock to rock, using the terrain for cover, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind them. She could hear the posse following, but they were cautious now, wary of the woman with the broken bottle and the wild look in her eyes. The chase was slow, a grim, stumbling retreat through the rocks and scrub. It was his knowledge of the land, imprinted on her in their short time together, that saved them. She knew the game trails, the hidden crevices, the paths that would be invisible to the men from town. She dragged him into a narrow wash, its high walls hiding them from view, and followed it back toward the shack, her lungs burning, her dress torn and stained with his blood. By the time she got him inside the line shack, the sun was setting, and she was on the verge of collapse. She eased him onto their rough pallet of blankets, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone clean through his side, but he had lost a great deal of blood, and the entry and exit wounds were ragged and dirty. The days that followed blurred into a living nightmare. Eleanor, who had once fainted at the sight of a pricked finger, became a nurse, a doctor, a fierce guardian. She tore her own petticoat into strips for bandages. She boiled water over their smoky fire to clean the wound, her stomach churning at the sight of it. She used the last of their whiskey as an antiseptic, ignoring his guttural moan of pain. She foraged for the herbs Colt had once shown her, yarrow to staunch the bleeding, willow bark to chew for the fever. The fever came on the second day, a raging fire that consumed him. He thrashed on the pallet, his body drenched in sweat. He began to murmur, his words a nonsensical tangle of English and a language she did not understand. A soft, guttural tongue she assumed was Apache. He cried out in the night, his hands reaching for unseen enemies. He was lost in the wilderness of his own pain, and she was the only one there to tether him to the world. She never left his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of broth between his cracked lips, and held his hand, whispering to him, telling him to stay, to fight. In the depths of the fever, his past came pouring out. He murmured his mother's name, Nalin, over and over, his voice filled with a child's aching loss. He spoke of his father, of the fire, of the hanging tree. He relived the moments that had forged him, the traumas that he kept chained in the silent depths of his soul. Eleanor listened, her heart breaking for the boy he had been, for the man he had become. She was seeing the raw, unvarnished truth of him, the foundation of pain upon which he had built his life. On the fourth night, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time in days. He was terribly weak, his face gaunt, but he was lucid. He looked at her exhausted face, her blood-stained dress, the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the basin of water, the discarded, bloodied bandages. He saw what she had done. His voice was a dry, rasping whisper. "You are still here." "Of course I am still here," she said, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "Where else would I be?" He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on his temple. "You should have left me," he whispered. "You should have run." He looked at her again, his gaze so raw, so vulnerable. It felt like he was baring his very soul. "I am afraid," he admitted, the words costing him a visible effort. "Afraid that you will leave when you see how broken I really am, when you see the animal." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. His deepest fear was not of dying, but of being abandoned, of being seen and then rejected. She thought of her own past, of being called hysterical, of her bruises being ignored, of being told she was the one who was broken. She thought of the way he had knelt at her feet and tended her split lip, the way he had held back his own rage for her sake. She leaned down, her hair falling around her face like a curtain. She pressed a gentle kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "I already saw," she whispered against his skin. "A long time ago." And with those words, the dam of her own control finally broke. The fear, the exhaustion, the horror of the past few days, all of it came pouring out in a flood of silent, racking sobs. She collapsed beside him, her head on his uninjured shoulder, and wept until there were no tears left. He was too weak to hold her, but he lifted his hand and rested it on her hair. A simple, profound gesture of comfort. In that broken-down shack, surrounded by blood and fear. They were stripped bare, and in that nakedness, they found not shame, but a love that was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. His recovery was slow, but it was steady. As his strength returned, so did a new sense of resolve. The fear was still there, but it had been burned away into something harder, something more focused. They were no longer just surviving. They were planning. "We cannot stay here," Colt said one afternoon, his voice stronger now. He was sitting up, leaning against the wall of the shack. "They will be back." "We cannot run forever," Eleanor replied, looking at him. "There is nowhere to go where men like James will not find us, or create more men like him." His words from that morning in the shack echoed in her mind. Maybe it is time we did. It was time. They would not hide. They would not run. They would return to redemption, and they would fight. Not with guns, not at first. They would fight with the truth. "Rathburn has the law on his side," Colt said, the old bitterness in his voice. "Then we must find a higher law," Eleanor said, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Or prove that his law is a lie." He spoke of a contract, the one my father signed. He claimed it made me his property. If we could prove that is false. "How?" An idea began to form in Eleanor's mind, a memory of a woman from town, a woman who had always been on the periphery, an elderly widow named Martha Blackwood. She lived in a small, neat house on the edge of town and kept to herself. But Eleanor had seen her. She had seen the way Martha looked at Colt, not with the fear or contempt of the others, but with a flicker of something sad and knowing. And she had heard the whispers, that years ago, before her husband had died. Martha had been in love with an Apache man, a love that the town had crushed. They rode into town under the cover of darkness, moving like ghosts through the back alleys. They went to Martha's house. The old woman opened the door a crack, her face wary, a shotgun held loosely in her hands. When she saw them, her expression softened. She ushered them inside, into a home filled with the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke. They told her everything. As they spoke, Martha nodded, her eyes filled with a deep, weary understanding. When they were done, she was silent for a long time. "Men like Rathburn think they own the world," she finally said, her voice raspy with age. "And men like our sheriff help them carve it up. I have seen it before." She looked at Colt, a deep sadness in her eyes. "The man I loved, they ran him off his land with a piece of paper from a judge in Santa Fe, said his claim was invalid. The man who ended up with the land was a friend of the judge's." She went to an old wooden chest in the corner and pulled out a stack of papers. "My husband was a clerk at the land office for a time. He hated the corruption, but he was a careful man. He made copies of things that did not look right." She sifted through the papers until she found 2 documents. One was a copy of the land grant for the acreage James Rathburn had bought for the railroad spur. The other was a bill of sale for a plot of land adjacent to it, sold for a pittance to Sheriff Miller just a week after Rathburn's arrival. And tucked within the paperwork was a copy of a legal document, a draft agreement between Rathburn and Eleanor's father. But in the margins, in her late husband's spidery handwriting, was a note, voided E. Bishop Sr. refused terms RE Physical Discipline Clause. Original returned April 12, 73. It was the proof. The contract James had been waving in the sheriff's face was a lie. He was not her legal guardian or fiancé. He was a predator, armed with forged papers and the town's willing ignorance. They had their weapon. Their plan was to present the evidence at the next town council meeting, to expose James and the sheriff in front of the whole town. They spent the next few days with Martha, preparing, planning their words. But redemption had eyes and ears. Their return had been noted. One evening, as Colt walked the perimeter of Martha's small property, he saw a shadow detach itself from a nearby group of trees. He was being followed. The next morning, when he went to the water barrel outside the back door to get water for coffee, he found it was full of a strange, oily substance. Someone had poured poison into their water supply in the night. The threat was no longer a matter of public humiliation or legal maneuvering. It was a cold, hard promise of death. That night, in the small, safe room Martha had given them, they knew it could be their last. The weight of what was to come, the very real possibility that they would not survive the next day, pressed in on them. They did not speak of their fear. Instead, they turned to each other. They made love with a quiet, desperate intensity, a fierce affirmation of life in the face of death. It was a clinging, a holding on, a silent promise that whatever happened tomorrow, they had each other. It was not a retreat from the world, but a gathering of strength, a final, intimate communion before the battle. As they lay in the darkness, listening to the lonely sound of the wind, they knew they were no longer running. They were ready. The town hall in Redemption was not a hall of justice. It was a small, stifling room that smelled of stale tobacco, sweat, and the cheap whiskey James Rathburn had been buying for anyone who would listen. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, turning the faces of the assembled townsmen into grotesque masks of anger and suspicion. They were packed in tight, a single, many-headed creature breathing resentment, their judgment already passed. At the front of the room, on a low, makeshift stage, sat the mayor, a nervous man who owned the general store. Flanked by Sheriff Miller and James Rathburn, James looked perfectly at ease, a king holding court, his expensive suit a stark rebuke to the poverty of his surroundings. He was the picture of righteous indignation, a civilized man wronged by a savage. When Colt, Eleanor, and Martha Blackwood entered, a low, hostile murmur rippled through the crowd. They were a trio of outcasts. Walking willingly into the lion's den, they stood at the back, three silent figures against a wall of animosity. The meeting began, a farce of civic procedure. The mayor read the new ordinance about land ownership, his voice trembling slightly. Then, Sheriff Miller stood and spoke of the importance of protecting the town's women, his eyes fixed on Eleanor, his tone thick with insinuation. Finally, Colt stepped forward. He held the papers Martha had given them. "There are things you should know," he began, his voice low and clear, cutting through the thick air. "About James Rathburn, about the sheriff. This is not about the law. It is about greed." He had not finished his sentence before the shouting began. "Sit down, breed!" someone yelled from the crowd. "We do not need your kind telling us about the law," another voice echoed. The room erupted, the carefully stoked hatred, fueled by whiskey and fear, exploded into a wall of noise. Shouts of savage and liar drowned out Colt's words. He stood his ground, his face a mask of stone, but it was useless. They would not listen. They did not want to hear. They wanted a villain, and he had been cast in the part long ago. The mayor banged his gavel, a frantic, useless sound against the roar of the mob. Seeing it was hopeless. Colt fell silent, his eyes sweeping over the snarling faces, a profound and weary disappointment in his gaze. James Rathburn smiled, a small, triumphant smirk. He had won. But then, a new voice rose, quiet but carrying. It was Eleanor. She had stepped forward, away from the wall, into the center of the room. Her hands were trembling, but her head was held high. In her hand, she held a single, folded piece of paper. It was not the legal documents. It was a letter, its paper fine and cream-colored, the ink a faded black. A letter she had kept hidden for years, a relic of her life in Boston. "You will listen to me," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The room, surprised by this new development, quieted slightly. James's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "My former fiancé speaks of contracts and of his concern for my welfare," Eleanor said, her eyes locked on James. "He has painted himself as my rescuer. I would like to share with you the nature of his concern." She unfolded the letter. James's face went pale. He knew what it was. He started to rise, to protest, but the room was utterly still now, captivated. Eleanor began to read. Her voice, at first a near whisper, grew stronger with every word. "My dearest Eleanor," she began, the salutation a mockery. "Your father and I have spoken at length about your nervous disposition, your fancies and emotional outbursts. He agrees with me that a firm hand is what is required. Upon our marriage, you will find I am a most attentive husband. I will not tolerate disrespect or hysteria. Be assured, any such behavior will be met with the appropriate physical discipline, a method your father has sanctioned as necessary for the shaping of a proper wife. I look forward to taming that wild spirit of yours." She finished reading and looked up, her gaze sweeping across the stunned, silent faces. The air in the room was thick and heavy. The men were no longer a mob. They were individuals, husbands and fathers. And they had just heard the cold, clinical promise of brutality, written in a gentleman's hand. The silence was more damning than any accusation. Sheriff Miller, seeing the tide turn, recovered first. He stood up, his hand on his gun. "This is slander. She is a hysterical woman, a runaway, conspiring with an abductor. I am placing you under arrest, Mrs. Maddox, for public disturbance and maligning a respected citizen." He started to move toward her, but a figure blocked his path. It was Martha Blackwood, the old widow, who had lived on the edge of town for years. A quiet ghost of a forgotten story, now stood in the center of it all, her back straight, her eyes blazing with an ancient fury. "You will sit down, Roy Miller," she said, her voice raspy but carrying the weight of authority that only age and a clear conscience can provide. "I knew your father. He was a weasel, but even he would be ashamed of you tonight. You call yourself the law? You are a puppet for a rich man's cruelties. Is this what redemption has become? A place where a woman can be beaten for speaking the truth, and a good man is condemned for the color of his skin? Shame on you, shame on all of you for listening." The sheriff stopped, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. The crowd shifted, their eyes darting from the sheriff to Martha, to the pale, tight face of James Rathburn. The certainty had been broken. Doubt, a far more dangerous seed, had been planted. In that moment of suspended chaos, Colt moved. He stepped up beside Eleanor, his presence a solid, unwavering shield. He did not look at the sheriff or the crowd. He looked only at James, his eyes black and flat as a winter night. "This is not a matter for the law," Colt said, his voice quiet but echoing in the silent room. "This is between you and me." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Outside of town, Dawn." It was not a question. It was a sentence. James Rathburn, for the first time in his life, looked truly afraid. He had fought his battles in boardrooms and with contracts, with the weight of his money and his name. He had never faced a man who was willing to settle a debt with his life. He looked to the sheriff for help, but Miller was still reeling from Martha's public shaming. He looked to the crowd, but their faces were now closed, their loyalties uncertain. He was alone. "This is barbaric," James stammered. "It is final," Colt said. He took Eleanor's arm. "We will be there." And then they turned and walked out of the town hall, leaving a shattered silence behind them. The dawn came wrapped in a thick, cold fog. It clung to the ground, muffling the world in a blanket of gray. Visibility no more than 20 paces. It was a ghostly, liminal time, neither night nor day. Outside of town, in a flat clearing by the creek, the two men faced each other. A handful of spectators had come, drawn by the grim promise of a final resolution. They stood like phantoms in the mist. James was shaking, his fine suit looking absurd and out of place in the damp morning air. He held his pistol awkwardly, as if it were a foreign object. Colt stood perfectly still, his body relaxed, his expression calm. He was not a man fueled by rage. He was an instrument of consequence. The sheriff, his face grim, counted out the paces. When he gave the signal to turn, James fired wildly. A panicked shot that went wide, splintering the bark of a cottonwood tree. Colt did not rush. He turned, raised his arm in a single, fluid motion, and fired. The shot was a flat, hard crack in the foggy silence. James Rathburn stood for a second, a look of profound surprise on his face, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his pristine white shirt. Then he crumpled to the ground. It was over. Colt stood for a moment, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun, looking at the man he had just killed. There was no triumph in his face, only a deep, profound sadness. The sheriff walked over to James's body, checked for a pulse, and then looked up at Colt, his face a mask of cold, official fury. His authority had been challenged, his benefactor killed. Now, he would reclaim his power. "Colt Maddox," he declared, his voice ringing with false authority. "You have committed murder in my jurisdiction. I hereby declare you an outlaw. There is a bounty on your head, $500, dead or alive." Before Colt could react, the sheriff's men, who had been waiting in the fog, raised their rifles. Colt did the only thing he could. He turned and vanished into the mist, the sound of his running footsteps quickly swallowed by the gray silence. Eleanor, who had been watching from a distance with Martha, felt her world collapse. He was gone, an outlaw, a hunted man, and she was alone. The sheriff's men surrounded her. "You are under arrest," Miller sneered, his confidence restored. "Conspiracy to murder." They dragged her to the town jail and threw her in a cell. It was a cold, damp space with a dirt floor and a single, high, barred window. It smelled of despair. Her life had become a series of ever-shrinking cages. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet hell. The deputy, Miller, took a special pleasure in her torment. He would withhold her food, then offer her a piece of bread with a leering grin. He struck her once, a backhanded slap that split her lip again, a cruel echo of their first violent encounter. He wanted to break her, to see her cry and beg, so Eleanor stopped speaking. She retreated into a fortress of silence, the same defense she had built against James in Boston. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. She sat on the hard cot, staring at the stone wall, her face a blank mask, her spirit withdrawn to a place they could not touch. She was a body in a cell, nothing more. Her silence infuriated them, but it also unnerved them. She was a ghost in their jail, a silent testament to their corruption. The town was divided. Some, swayed by Martha's words and the ugliness of James's letter, believed her. Others saw her as a wicked accomplice, a woman who had driven a good man to his death. One evening, a young girl came to the jail, bringing a basket of food for the sheriff, a common occurrence. The girl's name was Sarah, and her father was a farmer who had lost his land in a crooked deal with the sheriff years ago. As she passed Eleanor's cell, she stumbled, dropping the basket. While the guard cursed and helped her pick up the spilled biscuits, her hand slipped through the bars. She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Eleanor's hand. Later, when she was alone, Eleanor unfolded it. The handwriting was rough, but she recognized it instantly. "They are hunting me in the hills. Do not lose hope. I will find a way. See," a flicker of warmth in the cold darkness. He was alive. He was thinking of her. The girl, Sarah, came back 2 days later, and again the week after that, each time with another small, precious note, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of despair. Colt was in the mountains, moving, hiding, but he had not forgotten her. One night, Sarah brought not just a letter, but a small pencil and a blank piece of paper. She pressed them into Eleanor's hand with a conspiratorial whisper. "You write back," she said. "I will get it to him." Eleanor sat on her cot in the near darkness, the pencil and paper clutched in her hand. The silence had been her shield, but it was also her prison. To write back was to hope. To hope was to risk having that hope crushed. She looked at the blank page, and for the first time in days, she felt a crack in the ice that had encased her heart. She thought of Colt, alone in the mountains. She thought of his courage, his quiet strength. She thought of his promise. She leaned against the cold stone wall, the rough paper on her knees. Her lips moved, forming a familiar, desperate prayer, but this time, it was not a plea for oblivion. It was a vow of conspiracy, a promise to a man in the mountains, a secret shared with a sympathetic girl. She whispered the words into the darkness of her cell. "Don't tell anyone." And then she began to write. The months in the jail bled into one another, each day a gray copy of the one before. Winter descended upon the territory, a lean and hungry wolf of a season that starved the land and froze the hope in men's hearts. The wind howled around the corners of the jailhouse, a lonely, keening sound that seemed to echo the emptiness inside Eleanor. She kept her silence, a cold, hard shield against the world. Her secret correspondence with Colt was her only warmth, small scraps of paper that were a universe of hope in the suffocating darkness. Her release, when it came, was not a moment of triumph. It was a quiet, shame-faced affair. Word of her trial, of James Rathburn's letter, and of the subsequent duel had trickled out of the territory, carried by traveling salesmen and freight drivers. A reporter from a Santa Fe newspaper arrived, a curious man with a notebook and too many questions. He was followed by another from Denver. Suddenly, redemption was under a microscope, its dirty laundry being aired for all the world to see. Sheriff Miller, who thrived in the shadows of local power, withered under the glare of outside scrutiny. The official story of a conspiracy to murder began to look flimsy, and the continued imprisonment of a woman who was increasingly being portrayed as a victim became an embarrassment. One cold morning, the cell door creaked open. Miller did not look at her. "You can go," he grunted, turning his back. There was no apology, no paperwork. They just wanted her gone. Eleanor stepped out into the weak winter sunlight, a ghost returning to a world that no longer knew what to do with her. The town was a fractured thing. As she walked down the main street, her few belongings in a small bundle, she felt the divide. Some townsfolk, mostly women, gave her small, sympathetic nods. They had heard the words from James's letter and recognized a truth they knew in their own bones. Martha Blackwood met her at the edge of town with a warm coat and a small bag of food, her embrace a silent blessing. But others turned away, their faces hard with judgment. They saw her as a temptress, a wicked woman who had brought death and trouble to their town. She was a living reminder of a story they wanted to forget. She was the woman who had loved the wrong man. She did not linger. There was only one place for her to go. She bought a scrawny mule with the last of the money Martha pressed into her hand and rode out toward the canyons. The journey was cold and lonely, the landscape stark and unforgiving under the winter sky. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered pursuit. But she was not running from something anymore. She was riding toward a hope so fragile she hardly dared to give it a name. She reached the line shack as the sun was setting, painting the red rocks in shades of blood and rust. The canyon was utterly silent, a silence that felt both vast and empty. Her heart sank. The shack looked deserted, a forgotten relic in a forgotten land. She pushed open the door, her breath held tight in her chest. The room was empty. His bedroll was gone. The water bucket was dry. She stood in the middle of the dirt floor, the cold seeping into her bones. He was gone. The months of waiting, of hoping, had been for nothing. A wave of despair, colder than any winter wind, washed over her. She sank to her knees, the small bag of food falling from her numb fingers. And then she felt it, a faint, residual warmth. She crawled to the stone hearth, her hands outstretched. The ashes were gray, but beneath them, a single ember pulsed with a faint, deep red glow. The fire was warm. He had been here recently. The knowledge was a jolt, a current of life in her frozen limbs. She did not know if he was coming back, but he was alive, and he had been here, in their place. It was enough. She unrolled her own thin blanket, built up the fire from that single, precious ember, and waited. For 3 days, she waited. She rationed her food, gathered firewood, and scanned the canyon rim for any sign of movement. The silence was her constant companion. Hope and fear wrestled within her, a constant, exhausting battle. The dust storm began on the evening of the 3rd day. It started as a low brown haze on the horizon and grew into a roaring, suffocating wall of grit and wind. The sky turned a sickly yellow. The world outside the shack dissolved into a maelstrom of howling chaos. Eleanor barred the door and stuffed rags into the cracks of the walls, but the fine, silt-like dust seeped in everywhere, coating her tongue, stinging her eyes. The shack groaned under the assault of the wind, threatening to fly apart. In the midst of the storm's roar, she heard another sound, a banging on the door, hard and insistent. Her heart leapt into her throat. Was it the sheriff? A bounty hunter who had tracked Colt here? She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her knuckles white. "Eleanor!" The voice was a raw, desperate shout, nearly swallowed by the wind. It was his. She fumbled with the wooden bar, her hands shaking, and threw the door open. He stumbled in, half pushed by the force of the wind, and slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it as if his legs could no longer hold him. He was a man carved from hardship, thinner than she had ever seen him, his clothes little more than rags, his face all sharp angles and hollows, covered in a rough, dark beard. There were new lines around his eyes, lines of pain and exhaustion and a fierce, hunted watchfulness. He had been stripped down to the bone, to the very essence of himself. He was changed, but he was here. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, the firelight flickering between them, the storm raging outside. The world was reduced to this single, protected space. To the two of them, they just stared at each other, drinking in the sight of the other. A long, silent conversation passing between them. His eyes asked if she was all right. Hers told him she had waited. He said nothing. He did not need to. She dropped the poker with a clatter and ran. She threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her arms wrapping around him as if she could fuse them together, could make it so they could never be separated again. He held her just as tightly, his face buried in her hair, his whole body trembling with the release of a tension he had held for months. He smelled of pine and dust and cold mountain air. He smelled like home. They did not need to run anymore. They made the decision that night, huddled by the fire as the dust storm slowly blew itself out. This canyon, this harsh, beautiful, secret place, would be their home. To run would be to admit defeat, to let the world win. Here they would make their stand. The land claim law, Eleanor said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. The one they used against you. It does not apply to me. Colt looked at her, understanding dawning in his tired eyes. "Your name," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You could file the claim." It was an act of quiet, radical defiance. They would use the white man's law, the law designed to exclude and dispossess him, to build their sanctuary. The land was harsh, but it was unclaimed. It was theirs for the taking, if they had the courage to hold it. And so they did. Eleanor rode into the territorial capital, her face grim and determined, and filed the homesteading papers under the name Eleanor Bishop. There was no Maddox on the document. To the world, she was a widow, a single woman taming a piece of the wilderness. To them, she was a queen claiming her kingdom. They built their life in the canyon, piece by piece. They replaced the leaking roof of the shack, built a stone floor, added a room. With the money from the few horses Colt had managed to capture and break in the mountains, he bought breeding stock, a tough, resilient line of Mustangs that thrived in the harsh country. His skill with horses, once just a job, became an art, his reputation spreading slowly through the territory. Men who needed a good horse learned it was worth the long ride into the canyons to buy from the quiet man who lived there. Eleanor, who had once learned needlepoint and French, found a new calling. The few other families who scratched out a living in the surrounding canyons had children who were growing up as wild as the land itself, with no knowledge of reading or writing. She cleaned out the old barn on their claim and turned it into a schoolhouse. She taught the children their letters and their numbers. Her classroom filled with the children of homesteaders and prospectors, a rough, eager collection of students who saw her not as a fallen woman, but as the only teacher they had ever known. Years passed. They were not easy years. They survived droughts that turned the creek to dust and storms that threatened to wash their home away. They survived the lingering threat of the law. The bounty on Colt's head faded with time, but it never entirely disappeared. A few times, a greedy bounty hunter would ride into the canyon, drawn by old rumors. None of them ever rode out. Their life was etched with the scars of their past and the constant struggle of the present. But it was a life filled with a deep, unspoken love. It was in the way he would leave a rare desert wildflower on her pillow in the morning. It was in the way she would sit with him by the fire at night, mending his clothes, their shoulders touching. No words needed. They had been forged in the crucible of violence and fear, and their bond was stronger than steel. They had built a life not just in silence, but with silence, a shared language that was more intimate than any spoken word. Sometimes, strangers would pass through, cowboys or prospectors on their way to somewhere else. They would stop for a night, sharing their fire and their food. Seeing the quiet, formidable man and the graceful, self-possessed woman, they would often grow curious. "How did you two meet?" a young drifter asked one evening, his eyes full of innocent curiosity. Colt did not answer. He just looked into the fire. Eleanor gave the man a small, serene smile, the same answer she always gave. "We do not talk about it." And every night, when the chores were done and the world was shut out, when they were alone in the home they had built with their own hands, Colt would turn to her. He would kiss her, a hard, possessive kiss that was still touched with the memory of desperation, a kiss that claimed her and anchored him all at once, and she would melt into him, safe and whole, her past and present finally reconciled in his arms. She would press her lips to his ear, her voice a sacred, loving whisper, a vow that had transformed from a shield of fear into the seal of their private world. Don't tell anyone. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from so you can connect with other listeners. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and please share your thoughts with us in English.